Hello and welcome to the final installment of RockCreek at COP26. RockCreek took part in the summit in Glasgow, and we hosted a number of discussions with leading investors, policymakers, scientists, and today we have a chance to take a step back and look at what was accomplished, what happened, what did not happen, what were we hoping would happen, and what might happen in COP27. People are already talking about that. In this special briefing for members and friends of the Greenwich Economic Forum, also, we have the pleasure to speak with RockCreek Senior Managing Director Ken Lay and Senior Advisor for Climate and Energy, Kerry Duggan. Ken is former Treasurer of the World Bank and architect of the first Green Bond. He was in Glasgow and can give us the view from the hallways and the rooms where the climate negotiations happened. Kerry is an expert on climate and energy policy, and she spent several years at the Department of Energy and served as at the White House as Deputy Policy Director for then Vice President Biden. Given the news this week of President Biden signing the infrastructure bill into law, I also will take a little time to unpack what it means for climate and sustainable infrastructure investments in the years ahead with our two wonderful speakers. Ken, Kerry, thank you so much for joining me today.
A pleasure. Good to be here.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you. Ken, you were in Glasgow, and I'm just curious, what was going on the ground that we did not read about, that was not obvious to people who were not there in person?
Well, I think, you know, it's interesting. This is the second of these COPs that I have attended. And what I noticed that I think was it was quite noticeable was the sense of urgency that everyone has got now. And I think obviously this has come partly because of the recent IPCC report and the indications that were in it about the shortfalls in meeting the targets. And I think also then to have had that come right as we were experiencing these recent weather events, I think has really focused people's attention. And I think that, so I think that to me was the overwhelming thing. I had, the other thing that I think it's a corollary to that, which was very evident, was I think an increasing emphasis on adaptation, because we've spent so much of our time on the mitigation issue, and quite properly so. But I think a number of the attendees from some of the, I would call them more immediately exposed countries, the SIDS, were adamant that we needed increasing resources for the adaptation challenge. So I think it was those two things mainly. There was also, and again, there were some big numbers thrown around, but I think there was also there was a sense on the part of a lot of people that we really need to start seeing implementation and getting that money out the door in order to have the impacts that that the sponsors of these efforts have advertised for them.
Ken, you said that, you talked a little bit about the positive things that were going on, but as one could watch on some of the days, a number of activists were out there talking about how little was done for future generations, but also, for example, Generation Lab had a poll of youth. And what they found was that the young people are optimistic. At the same time, they will be choosing where they live, where they work, and their mode of transport very much based on their climate beliefs. With that said, do you think we need a generational shift to really make the changes we need to make?
I have been thinking that for some time now, honestly. And I am in that proverbial boomer generation. I have got millennial kids and I've got a Gen Z kid. And I can tell you, they are totally committed. They are saying, Dad, what are you people doing? And so I think it's exactly correct that we're going to see a generational shift. And I think that is going to help accelerate all of this.
Kerry, you've been watching the summit, but you're one of the most prominent people I know in the energy sector. You also have been advising the Department of Energy. You've been talking to many people in the industry. You are hands-on in Detroit, looking at what's happening locally and how industry and growth can happen in a major state in the United States. What was your take on Glasgow?
Yeah, it was really interesting because obviously I had lots of friends and colleagues that were there. So I was getting some ear hustling, is what we call it here in Detroit, from the sidelines. So overall, necessary but not sufficient. I'll probably say that 3 different times on our chat today. Like Ken, I have my accountability partners who are 8 and 13 here at home. So definitely necessary in terms of the high level commitments, but clearly some, disappointment. Even the president would say it wasn't enough what happened at COP26. But there were some bright spots, the commitments around deforestation and methane, and alignment in the financial sector. And I think, that's hopefully we'll spend a good chunk of time for this particular audience on where the opportunity is. But definitely some disappointment, particularly around commitments for the countries that have contributed the least to the climate crisis, who are impacted the most. As Ken said, there's room for doing more quickly. So I'm excited. I think I was reading sort of the closing remarks about how COP27 is now, and I think the real-time feeling, the sense of urgency that Ken mentioned is abundantly clear from, and I think our nation's leaders understand that urgency. But again, this was necessary, not sufficient, which is just the timing is so interesting to me, because we've got, during COP26, you've got the bipartisan infrastructure deal. We're on the cusp of getting the part 2. All of that is still just a down payment. It's not sufficient. So the private sector is so critical right now.
Yeah, you just were talking, Kerry, about the private sector, and you also referred to some of the pledges that Mr. Modi, of course, talked about 2070. We had, Brazil and 110 other countries who pledged to end and reverse deforestation by 2030. Although, Ken, I think they kind of reversed that a little bit. 90 countries pledged to limit methane emissions. All of those things were going on, as you said. But at the end of the day, it seems, we talked about young people, but it's the private sector that seems to be the driving force versus the public sector. So the various stakeholders in the private sector, I think, seem to be pushing much harder. And Kerry, I know you work with public-private partnerships, and many nonprofits as well as for-profits. What is your take on sort of the relative role of these and how they're going to partner together? Because you've worked across those for many years yourself.
That's right. Thanks, Afsaneh. I have been a believer in that it's going to be a cross-sector collaboration, and we saw that clearly. Public sector, the job is to deliver the framework. We have a framework. Is it perfect? No. But the role of the private sector is that it can move at speed and scale. It can be more responsive. It can be more creative. And if I leave you with anything today, I'm really looking for where our friends in the financial sector can align with the technologists that have novel technologies that can deliver the disruptive change. I obviously have an energy background. Those are going to be really important partnerships, but in the same sense, I'm also looking at atypical partners, and you've done a really great job of this, Afsaneh, of getting new people, particularly people of color and women, into the conversation to deliver a whole new set of outcomes that haven't been realized yet. So I think the framework is there from the public sector. I think the financial sector can help push industry to deploy what we know works right now while we disrupt and innovate and change the way of doing business. So I think the roles are pretty clear. It's a question for me, and this came up in some of the readout COP26, is the need for more collaboration. And it can't be the same faces, Afsaneh. I mean, they gave a gender day at COP26, and I think our view is that's every day. That's every day at RockCreek. So that's my read on it.
But sort of moving on that very point, Catherine Flowers, your very good friend, has written this great book on climate justice. And I think, there are people who might say, what does that have to do with the subject at hand? But if you listen to Britt Harris, he will say actually, and Britt is at UTIMCO now, this is the biggest opportunity for investors in a lifetime. So in fact, climate justice is not just this other thing, which is to help those who were hurt by others in terms of how climate impacted their livelihood. But all of those things are creating a lot of potential opportunities in public and private markets that that everyone really can take advantage of, whether they're running an endowment, a pension fund, a sovereign fund, or any other investment pool. So again, sort of what can investors do, Ken, to help the countries that are in this race, so as to speak?
Well, I think the key, and this is as you can appreciate, this gets complicated very quickly. A significant amount, I've talked to a number of the major investors, and exactly as you've indicated, and as you quoted, Brett, they are seeing tremendous opportunities. As soon as you move into the emerging markets, they are immediately also concerned about the ongoing perception of risk and so forth, and the difficulty of getting the on the ground projects done. And this is it's quite interesting. And there was a good degree of discussion in the hallways in Glasgow about what do we have to do to get that moving. Historically, you would have looked to the multilateral banks and so forth, but I think everyone understands that capacity, there's both an issue of repurposing, and there's also just the sheer capacity there. So what I think is that we need to be trying to figure out how to get significantly more effort into that. And there's a chicken and egg problem, because to a certain extent, we also, in addition to seeing that flow, we also need to see available, affordable financing for it. And that's what historically the MDBs have provided in a lot of contexts, whether it's the IFC or the World Bank or whatever. But we need to see a lot more of that so that project developers can say, yes, I can now move out, work hard to develop the projects on the ground, because I know that there's going to be the long-term takeout financing. I don't mean to get into the weeds about this, except that it's essential if we're going to actually see the deployment of this tremendous, the global savings in the way that we need to see it deployed for this effort.
Ken, about 100 billion was earmarked from developed countries for developing countries to use, but it seems like that actually those funds have not yet cleared the bank. Last I got it. On the other hand, you just referred to the leverage impact of the multilaterals. The days when you and I worked at the World Bank, I remember on the clean energy side, for example, every dollar we put in, you got $10 from the private sector. Today, every dollar you put, from what I understand from Secretary Kerry and others, is 29 to 39 cents. So how is that going to change back to not just 10 times, but maybe 20 times or more, so that all the things that need to get done, because even 100 billion doesn't go very far when we see all the numbers that we're seeing in terms of the needs, but also the opportunities with potential return. So how would you do that dynamic?
I do think that there's a couple of issues that the MDBs need to deal with. I think there has been, since you and I were there, the transaction costs of doing business with I'm most familiar with the World Bank, but other MDBs as well. The transaction costs have continued to increase, and this is not necessarily for bad reasons, but there's a risk that the perfect will become the enemy of the good, and that has in some respects hampered the project development that these entities had done, which of course then alongside those projects is where we saw a tremendous amount of the private sector engagement. I think there's also been some concern about, I guess what I call over leveraging the franchise value of these institutions. And I think that's another area where I think there's going to have to be some more openness. There are some good, I just recently took on the chairmanship of IFM. Well, there is a situation where you've got a number of sovereign sponsors who have outsourced deployment for this facility to Gavi, and they've outsourced the treasury management to the World Bank. Well, there's a lot of opportunities for the bank and some of the other MDBs to do more of that, which would help with exactly what you're discussing, trying to up that engagement. But there has seemed to be some. It's not been easy for that to happen.
Kerry, last week you spoke with Crystal Davis, Director of World Resources Institute's Land and Carbon Lab. And she summed up things nicely when she said political ambition and commitment is a good thing, but it's really just the starter pistol at the beginning of the marathon. It started the race, but we still need to run the 26 miles. In your view, what can investors do to help countries run this race, so to speak?
Yeah, it's time to lace up. Fascinating conversation with her, particularly around their new available data. But one of the things I was left with from that conversation is, considering what you're incenting when you're investing was number one, and also considering what you're ignoring. And so as I think about those opportunities and getting our hands on data sets, the other thing that Crystal shared is, data is only as good as the human that's handling it. So understanding, the analytics around these data sets. And I'll also just offer to you that the conversations I've been in of late are really around who actually has these data sets on climate impacts. Again, I think about what you've been doing at RockCreek and the conversations we've been in. You've been doing this, as I always kind of joke, before it was in fashion, and you're considering using data, robust data about what you're incenting through your investments, but what you're ignoring. And so I think, I've been thinking a lot about back to the climate summit that you put together over the summer and bringing new and fresh voices to the table, but on that ignoring side, like to Ken's point, you want to get into these spaces because the impact is really outsized and outmatched, but it's a matter of bringing new voices to the table. So yeah, Crystal was really great, and what they're doing is exciting. But it, when I think about how we actually operationalize and make this work matter, getting the data into the right hands, the right investors, the people who are actually going to consider these, and I think that's the topic of the day.
You're absolutely right, Kerry, because it seems like investors are yearning and they're really looking for projects. And there's so many projects out there that we all know are going to have the returns that investors need. In fact, so much of assets today are earning negative returns, right? So much, trillions and trillions of assets are in bonds getting negative returns. So anything on the climate side, which would be not just in the positive range, but up to double digits, could be very interesting. But matching those together, the supply of projects and the demand for projects needs a lot of help, whether it is from RockCreek or the World Bank or multilaterals or others in the private sector and the public sector to make this data more easily available. And as you said, we're grateful WRI for doing everything they're doing on that front. The other thing, Ken, I was going to mention is that obviously one of the things that during the Glasgow meetings happened was one of the biggest announcements, I think, about the Financial Alliance for Net Zero, or GAFANZ, which includes 450 financial institutions and 130 trillion of private capital. We've obviously at RockCreek signed up for that. And Ken, you told our senior advisory board member, John Lipsky, that this was potentially hugely important. And you mentioned the word potentially, which got me a little worried because I like the part about hugely important, but the potentially made me a little concerned. Now that you have a chance to take a closer look and you're back, do you think it is possible, as you said, to make sure that the pledges are authentic? They actually will get done this time?
I absolutely think it's possible. I think the issue that we come back to all the time is that we absolutely have. I think these institutions are very committed. I think the question is going to be, how does that commitment hold up? For example, as they go through the next 3 or 4 quarterly earnings reports, and they have to sit with their shareholders and talk about the returns. Now, I happen to think that actually, as we were discussing before, this is an opportunity. There's a tremendous opportunity here, and I think to the extent that that these institutions can navigate that and seize those opportunities, I don't think that's going to be a problem. I think it's going to work all the way around, and it's going to be, as others have said too, it's going to be this generation's, great growth opportunity. So we'll have to see, but I do think it's going to require a tremendous amount of diligence and persistence on the part of the management of every one of these institutions. I would also just say, and we may be getting to more of this later, I think it's going to help if the regulatory environment is adapted to these new risks, because I think to the extent that the accounting profession and the other regulators can make it clear that all of these risks are going to have to be quantified and incorporated into financial reporting and things like that. That will also, I think, change the landscape here. We've all seen the back and forth in the Labor Department about fiduciary responsibility and what that embodies. That kind of uncertainty, where that kind of discussion keeps flipping back and forth, we have to get past that, and we need to have consistency and all of that in the environment in which all these institutions are operating.
I think you put your finger on something really important, Ken, about the fiduciary duty. I think fiduciary duty is to make sure you don't invest in things that are going to become stranded assets or create problems for you in the long run, especially if you invest in certain fuels in the long run and then they don't really generate the returns. Sort of thinking about those kinds of fuels, I was struck that the COP26 climate pact had the language it had on coal specifically. And both of you have been involved on the policy side, on actual project side, on so many different sides of this conversation. And obviously the issues around managing the people who will get displaced if coal does not get produced or used, at the same time as you have so many huge opportunities for new job creation in new fuels and making that move from talk to action. Why is it that on this topic, really, it was US, it was China, it was India among the biggest ones? I don't want to use a strong word like disappointed, but they certainly were not where we would have liked them to be in terms of accelerating the phase out. So what do you both think? Kerry, can we start with you?
I don't think you're off the mark with disappointment. I think there's a big, maybe an exhale of exhaust, when that came out, and that became very clear. That made a huge wave in the news. But you're spot on thinking through what we call just transition for these types of communities that are dependent on resources such as coal, and figuring that out and figuring it out quickly. And I know that's top of mind not only for the U.S. president, but for governors. I live in Michigan, and that's definitely top of mind here because we have communities that are impacted. Another great opportunity, to my earlier point on collaboration, is learning from the communities abroad that have already gone through this.
Right.
And bringing those learnings and how to do it in a really thoughtful way, so that it becomes easier to set higher and more ambitious goals because you know what you're doing on the ground. Yeah, that was not everyone's favorite moment from COP.
Ken?
Yeah, I would just say that you see that map hanging behind me on the wall. That's the state of Wyoming. We are in the midst of this transition, and there are 4 coal-fired power plants in the state that are due to be retired, with huge potential impact on the communities. We recently had one really good piece of news, which is that the first of the Bill Gates TerraPower natrium reactors is going to replace one of those retiring coal-fired plants over the next several years. And they're going to retrain workers in the community to work in the place. And I make that point because we are going to need to see that kind of thing, whether, forget nuclear for a second, but we need to see that kind of thing accelerate, and to be very conscious about it. I know that there is a much more active discussion going on, but as we look at the new forms of energy and things like that, we have to clearly take all of this into account. And I'm just hoping that that to a certain extent, they're having these discussions in places like Chile and other countries, that we will develop what I guess I would call a transition template for what specific measures we can be taking in these kinds of settings, whether it's Michigan or Wyoming or India, wherever, to give governments a program that they can and private sector, but give governments a program that they can pursue to accomplish this.
Yeah, just to piggyback on that, Ken, I think it's another opportunity. We've talked about, even though there's been some disappointment, but there's also huge amounts of opportunity.
Right.
I used to use the term, as Afsaneh knows, of leapfrogging communities. But now I mentioned during the climate summit that RockCreek put on, for me, it's about slingshotting communities. And one of the things I'm so impressed by my former boss, the president, giving equal treatment both to the communities, such as coal communities, and their needs, as well as environmental justice communities that have had a different, set of impacts. And so those are where the bright spots are for me, is thinking through how we deliver just transition and justice 40. So that's kind of what I'm keeping my eye on, and looking for that template. Ken, I'd be happy to get that in my inbox when you all have put it together.
Yeah.
I think that is such an important point, because we can all sit, and complain about the fuels not getting moved, but it is really finding the solutions. And again, with coal, it's a very perfect situation. And Ken and I worked on sort of moving on cleaner fuels into many of these emerging markets. And that has been going on for a long time. This is not, this did not just happen with the COP meetings. This has been a very gradual, but a little bit too gradual, a little bit too slow. And as we speak, I think, Ken, correct me if I'm wrong, I think China is still selling coal power plants. Yeah. I know there's an agreement that they would stop, but it's not clear to me. And I heard I was on a panel with Sri Mulyani, and in Indonesia, they still have, despite their natural reserves of solar energy, but also even natural gas, which is a little better than, or a lot better than coal, they still have a lot of coal use in power.
Oh yeah, yeah. And this is in these countries. I mean, this is where India, of course, got into the pushback on the phase down versus phase out of coal, and then pushed. And of course, that's exactly where they are. And I recall, Afsaneh, we had some of our institutional clients had visited India several years ago. And I recall vividly the energy minister and his discussion about their plans, the Modi administration's plans for renewable energy. But of course, the implementation of all of that is tremendously complex. in a country like that. So I think all the support, any support that the rest of us can give in those major settings, whether it's China or India, Indonesia, is crucial.
I think it's what Carrie said earlier. How do you take your know-how and learning, both in terms of the technology, but also in terms of the social impact of this, and bring that experience to different places so that not everyone is starting from scratch. And that social part is equally important. During the first week of COP, I also spoke with Divya Seshamani, who argued we need to make much larger investments in adaptation and resilience. And she was worried that there's hope for the planet, but humans are fragile. So do you feel, again, Ken, you were walking the corridors there. Was that something that people are taking seriously and moving into COP27? Is your thoughts that we will be more serious in COP27 than 26?
Yes, I think so. I think there, some of there, it's very interesting to try to figure out what are adaptation measures that where you can define the economics of those so that you can quantify the benefits and hopefully attract additional capital to these efforts. Simple examples. I mean, and this is not an emerging market example, but if you look offshore after the Katrina incident in Louisiana, if they were to invest in restoring the bioshields, okay, the offshore marshes, the insurance costs would come down. Well, that is a kind of investment. If you can make those things visible, you can start accelerating these investments in that type of thing. And I think there's a number of areas where that is important, and there have been some discussions starting about it. But in other settings, there's just no question. People are going to have to start spending money on the adaptation measures that will avoid utter tragedy in some of these areas. I had been focused on the small island developing states. They're the most obvious example, and they were very vocal at the in Glasgow about the importance of the adaptation agenda.
As they may disappear, right? So
yeah, exactly.
Carrie, any thoughts at your end?
Yeah, I'm thinking back to my own pathway down through climate and working with Rosina Bierbaum back in like 2005, working on a summit on coping with climate change is what we called it back then. And she's, big on adaptation. I'm living and breathing that here in the Midwest, where everyone has their pick your climate impact depending on where you are. We had 1,000-year flooding. So
right.
To Ken's point, we're looking at what we do both on the hyper local sort of individual resident as well as the watershed. And so that's real time. Everything is real time now. Like I said, COP27 is right now. It started the minute after COP26 closed. And that's what I expect to see, that kind of urgency continue. I think it's in many ways frustrating that it's taken this long to take it this seriously, but this is not a moment to squander, particularly on adaptation. I think that did get a good amount of treatment, which is good. But as I said at the top of our meeting today,
right,
necessary, not sufficient.
Exactly. I think that we're going to sort of
right,
come back to that very important point you made, Carrie. Shifting gears slightly, because it is very related to what we've been talking about, is President Biden signing the 1.2 trillion infrastructure bill into law and everything else that is also getting signed. And this will start money flowing fairly immediately, right? Carrie, you would know a lot better. But the White House said that most will start next year. And the infrastructure law is 50% larger than the entire Recovery Act from the global financial crisis, which, Carrie, you played a part in implementing when it came to sustainable energy infrastructure. The law contains 73 billion for power infrastructure, a huge amount for electric vehicles. We've seen the impact of that on many electric vehicle companies. It contains enough climate resiliency money to make it the country's largest climate-focused piece of legislation. Kerry, on climate and sustainable infrastructure, what are you seeing here? You know, how much of this will happen? How fast is it going to move? And is it enough to have just the laws and the funds available? How do you make it actually move into your community?
Yep, I think that's what your average American is looking for, is the immediacy of the law. So the way I think about it is on two fronts. One is in government, you have these formula, you know, money is going to the states. And so I would expect you to see very quickly the ramp up of things like weatherization, energy efficiency happening. I was in those offices when they ballooned, as you said, during the Recovery Act a few years ago. So those are the things that you'll see kind of on the faster track. The big, bold, sweeping changes that need to happen, such as just overhaul of our grid to make room for, you know, the amount of renewables, is a huge part of the infrastructure investment. And so that's going to take a little bit more time because it's, as Ken explained, very complicated, a lot of actors in that space. The other thing I would say, Afsaneh, is that it's sort of parts 1 and 2. The bipartisan infrastructure deal, you know, everyone should just take a moment and realize how transformational it is. In, you know, in any of our time on this planet, we have not seen something this big, but that combined with the Build Back Better Act will truly be the largest investment this country's ever made in climate. So I have to give it its due there.
Right.
But in addition to grid, you're also looking at things like broadband access and really bringing in parts of the country who have otherwise been locked out. You know, from talking to me, that's something I'm keeping a close eye on for how folks who typically haven't been able to participate in the unlocking of this new clean energy economy will now have a chance. EV infrastructure, kind of an obsession of the president. You know, he was in town here just recently driving an all-electric Hummer. And he wants you to be able to go from DC to California, you know, fairly easily. So I think it's incredibly exciting. There's a lot of deferred maintenance in our country that needs attention. So you'll see there've been, you know, the cabinet members, the jobs cabinet have been out on the road, including the president, you know, walking across aged infrastructure. So that's going to get some treatment as well. So it is exciting. It will be transformational for our country. It's long overdue. But I think, you know, the stuff, at least from the Department of Energy, where I spend a lot of my time with my friends there, is on the grid. I think it's really exciting to make way for this, hopefully, you know, 100% clean energy by 2035 goal of the president.
And I think what is really good news is all of us are getting these notices from our local utilities, right? Do we want to switch to clean energy, encouraging us to move to clean energy? So at the consumer level, that's a huge change, because utility companies were not exactly fast movers. Ken talked about island economies, but also, you know, whether we talk about Puerto Rico, whether we talk about Hawaii, you know, these are diesel importers. They have a lot of climate-related problems and very little by the way of solar. But you're starting seeing that their utility companies are starting to invest in EV because they're seeing what's happening in the rest of the country. And the question is, again, this sort of private-public partnerships, because you will need both. And in a sort of situation where we're having, on the one hand, inflation, which is one of the concerns, how do you make sure this sector, you know, we want to make sure that investors see the opportunities, but also how do you make sure it's not overheated? And you know, as you said, Kerry, you need a lot of retraining of people, which means there will be a shortage of skills to do all of these projects that are, you know, that you talked about.
Yeah, that's another thing. The numbers I was seeing is combined with the bipartisan infrastructure deal and the Build Back Better Act, something 1.5 to 2 million jobs per year. That's intense. From the energy efficiency side, there are some opportunities that I think, are low barrier to entry jobs. And I think that's really important to make sure that everyone is included in the opportunity, but spot on to think about how the workforce piece of this is done, but not to ignore when the president was signing the bill, if you saw who he was visiting with just ahead of time, I mean, there's a huge emphasis on labor. So labor unions have been deeply engaged throughout this conversation. So I think that is, that's something they're super conscious of. And then you mentioned inflation, and not my area of expertise, but I have noted several times that 17 Nobel laureate economists have said this, the combined effort here should actually help support in that way. But going back to one other point you made, Afsaneh, I wrote down silos of excellence. It's a term I've been using for about a year now, because I love that. We have to get out of it. Right. We have to get out of it and talk to one another to make sure this is all done, as you said, thoughtfully, and that we're speaking to people's local economies right. And what's going on in this transition.
Exactly. And you touched on broadband, which is one of your favorite areas, and the importance of that last mile. Ken, you're from Wyoming, a very rural state and least populous in the country. How do you see, that development changing the shape of Wyoming?
Yeah, the whole issue is going to be implementation of it. Okay. I mean, I know from personal experience, living on a road that does not have broadband, where anybody who wants good internet, well, not even good internet, passable internet, has got to put a lot of money into satellite systems and everything. But it's very hard for me or a number of my acquaintances out there to see exactly how the infrastructure bill will be translated into fiber optic coming 15 miles up the road from the nearest town of 2,000 people. And I think this is so, I think if it can do it, it is, again, to use the word transformational. I'm just hoping that we can see how the infrastructure bill gets translated on the ground into that kind of effort. Because there's a reason that this hasn't happened before, which is that the utilities said, hey, there's only 3 customers up there.
Right.
And it's not worth it. And so, I think that's, we'll have to see. But I do think that it's, essential. And I think if we can get it done, if we can translate it into on the ground work, I think it will be great.
Well, Ken, I think you also got bombarded, Wyoming, other states that had relatively small populations, but rural populations got bombarded during COVID with a lot of people from urban areas. So maybe that will be a force to get more dollars into the into your areas. Kerry, I was curious, Illinois Senator Tammy Duckworth sponsored the measure within the bill called the Drinking Water and Wastewater Infrastructure Act of 2021, and that provides direct payments to replace lead service lines around the country. And in a related news, Michigan judge recently approved a huge amount of settlement in the Flint water crisis. So this crisis is real. People live through it, but it's not just Michigan. It is the rest of the country. Whether you're sitting in DC or you're sitting in Florida, or you're sitting in New York or many other places, our infrastructure, as you very correctly said, is old. So we need to do these things. It's kind of interesting that it was controversial. The other side, when I look, we saw Danish stocks take off last year hugely. We saw a lot of other clean energy related private companies take off because they're involved in parts to water systems. So again, for investors, these are huge opportunities. At the same time, we see people's eyes glaze over when they see this legislation or feel uncomfortable about it. So what's wrong with having clean water and good opportunities to invest?
I don't know how to answer that question, but I can say, obviously I was in and out of Michigan when the Flint water crisis was happening, and certainly aware of it. It's not the only town, as you mentioned. There's issues right now in our state. Sorry about my lighting. I'm going to back up a little bit. But the goal of the administration goal is to replace 100% of the lead service lines. So to Ken's point, how it's done is what matters. And right. I'm happily privy to some of the companies that are using advanced technology to help answer the question of where you go. And so, you know, in the background of this entire conversation, I'm thinking about the other technology companies who are on the cusp of really unlocking some of these opportunities for investment. So I'm excited, and I will leave this conversation equally as excited about the role of the private sector, of the financial community here to get engaged and you know, do your due diligence and your risk, but you're going to have to meet some new actors that you're not familiar with along the way. Water, Afsaneh, you know, near and dear to my heart. I'm a daughter of the Great Lakes. Lead is not the only issue. And so PFAS is also getting some treatment if you're following that. Yes. We have real challenges to overcome in water and in so many other spaces, but it's really about making the US competitive again globally, and that, you know, taking care of our assets. I mean, I could go on and on about water, but I won't.
Ken, any final thoughts on this subject?
No, I think we've covered it. I think it's going to be fascinating to see how it unfolds, also because we've had this rural to urban transition. I know because of the pandemic, it's tended to look like it was going the other way, but in general, you know, we've been seeing a generational shift into more urbanization, and I think that's also going to factor into how you know, how are we going to deal with the infrastructure priorities under those circumstances.
So finally, you know, we talked about the legislation that has passed or is about to pass, and the huge impact that could have on investments. We've talked about COP26, moving on to 27. What are your parting thoughts? You know, what do you think investors should concentrate on, and what, in your view, is sort of the biggest opportunity out there as we move into the next COP meeting? Ken, do you want to go first?
Okay, I'll give that a shot. I think I want to come back for investors. I think the key point here is to really focus on this as an opportunity. And because, as you know, I mean, it's tended over the last decade or so. A decade ago, this was all about more, oh, let's avoid, you know, we're gonna do a negative list or whatever. But now I think we're seeing a tremendous opportunity, and that came out so vividly at the COP. So I would simply say that's the key. And I think that investors seeking those opportunities, there's a circularity to this. As investors seek the opportunities, then the opportunities tend to materialize when the people that can deliver them say, oh, yes, the resources are there, let's get moving.
Gary?
The follow-up on that is going back to, in my mind, the Justice 40 framework that this administration, and I'm talking US specifically, has taken. I think that's a huge clue for the investment community, because that's a commitment they're taking very seriously. It's a whole of government attitude that 40% of every climate dollar spent by the administration will go to these communities that have been, you know, left behind for so many years. So I think that just backs up what Ken just said. So I would keep a close eye on how Justice 40 is unraveling, and look for those lead opportunities, because I think the impact opportunity, the returns, that's what I would be looking for.
Well, I can't thank you enough, Kerry. I can't thank you enough, Ken, for this great conversation. I look forward to our future conversations, and especially as this infrastructure bill gets actually implemented, I think we will have a lot to talk about. So thank you both, and see you very soon.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Very
Bye-bye.
good.